All right, I am going to invite you all to come to your seats. Because it was such a festive occasion with the Sunday after All Saints' Day and many baptisms and wonderful things, we are running just a little behind in getting started, but we have a fabulous presentation today, and I don't want us to miss out on too much of that. I must confess that I've already confessed to our speaker that I am looking forward to viewing his presentation later online, as I am co-teaching a class just across the hall. But George Maxwell asked me to kick us off this morning with prayer and then an introduction of a dear friend of George's, who in turn is going to introduce our esteemed speaker for today. The Lord be with you. Let us pray. Gracious God, at this time of year when we give special thanks for your calling us into community through the communion of saints, our sisters and brothers living and here on earth and living the life eternal, for those who have inspired us and comforted us and guided us on our own paths, so that in especially those hard times of our lives, we can know that we are not alone, but are surrounded by a great cloud of witnesses. Hear our prayers this day for all who live with loneliness and isolation. Show us how we might reach out and embrace especially those who don't easily find a welcoming community, those who may be different, those who may be persecuted, those who are left out for a variety of reasons. Help us through this upcoming class to learn something of how we may welcome those who might not so easily find a welcome elsewhere. Speak to us by your Holy Spirit, the word that each of us most needs to hear, through Christ our Lord. Amen. I am now pleased to welcome Alex Simmons, who is a dear friend, I just heard since 1984 or 1986, of George Maxwell, and I will say for sure that any friend of George Maxwell's is a friend of mine. So welcome, Alex Simmons, who will introduce our speaker.
Thank you. Good morning. I can tell you that I have absolutely zero qualifications to be standing in front of anybody in this group today, other than the fact that I'm a long-term friend of George Maxwell's. George had mentioned to me over lunch a few months ago that his theme for this fall had been that of isolation. And I had actually recently read the Frankenstein novel, which surprised me greatly because it actually really deals with that theme of isolation, and the monster's behavior all is associated with ultimately his isolation. I had mentioned that to George, and it struck a chord of interest in him. And the Atlanta Opera recently, just actually this last weekend, did a production of Frankenstein. And I had mentioned to George that I had run into a lecturer on Frankenstein, Dr. Eddy Mueller, who we'll be hearing from this morning. And George coincidentally was going to be absent today. And so the confluence of those events led to us having Dr. Eddy Mueller come in and talk about Frankenstein. Dr. Mueller is a author, a filmmaker, a pop culture historian, and long-term lecturer. And in 2018, he wrote a book on Frankenstein, which is a collection of essays talking about the long-standing worth of Mary Shelley's work. He's also recently released a film in the civil rights era. Remind me the name of the film? Small Steps. So with that introduction, I welcome Dr. Eddy Von Mueller this morning to talk about Frankenstein.
Good morning, everybody. I'm not used to this thing. I keep thinking somebody's standing there. I feel like a very old, fat Taylor Swift. So I was a college professor here in Atlanta for about 22 years. I taught at Georgia State University, and I taught at Emory University. And one of the things that I liked about my job, about teaching in a university setting, is there were all of these people who were actually smart and actually experts and doing really interesting things. And so I did a lot of team teaching. I teamed up with with colleagues in religion and in English and in African American studies and Asian American studies and law and medicine and history. And I did a lot of co-teaching. And one of the classes that I co-taught was with a physicist, Dr. Sid Perkowitz, because nothing goes better together than physics and film. And so we taught a course for a number of years together on science in film and how the depictions of science in motion pictures and television influence people in their thoughts about real science. And of course, one of the quintessential scientific figures in film history is that of Dr. Frankenstein. And he and I became interested in Frankenstein as a project. And I spent about 4 years. I watched every film that is extant that is based on Mary Shelley's novel. I found every comic strip and comic book. I found children's books in 14 different languages. Frankenstein is the most important story you think you know. It is one of the founding myths of modernity. No book, perhaps, that I can think of has retained and gained relevance over time like Frankenstein has. And it's interesting because Frankenstein becomes this very malleable figure, as does his monster, in each historical period. And the creature and the impulses that drive Frankenstein, they get pulled into political culture, and they get pulled into ethics discussions, they get pulled into law. And one of the things that struck me as I was watching all of these movies and reading all of these comic books and giving lectures in various places on this topic is how few of these adaptations of Mary Shelley's amazing 1816 book, how few of these adaptations actually pay any attention to what is made incredibly clear in the novel. And that is the psychology of the creature. And he's the creature, not a monster. And one of the things that we're going to talk about today is what makes a creature. And one of the things that we need to kind of be aware of is that when Mary Shelley was writing this book in the early 1800s, a lot of words that we're very comfortable with using today are not words that she was familiar with. The creature, from the same root, right, as create, creator, it is a created being. He is not made a monster by Frankenstein's creating him. Now, Frankenstein does, and we'll talk a little bit about what Frankenstein's crime is. Victor Frankenstein is a horrible person. He is also, as Dr. Perkowitz would like to remind our students, he's also a really bad scientist because he has no sense of ethics. But Frankenstein's creature is not made a monster by virtue of the fact that he is stitched together out of cadavers. He is not a monster because Frankenstein sins and transgresses in usurping the power of God and bestowing life on the lifeless. The creature is a monster because he's alone. It is the way that being, the creature, it's the way he's treated by his community, by strangers, by the law, but most of all, by the man who made him. It's the way this being is treated by the world around him that makes him a monster. So this idea, when Alex reached out to me, he said, hey, you know, they're doing this thing, the theme is isolation. That was music to my ears, because this is emphatically and very clearly one of the things that Mary Shelley is most interested in. Now, I mentioned I was a college professor for a long time, so I always like making people raise their hands. How many of you guys have ever read Frankenstein, the novel? Okay. For how many of you was that more than 15 years ago? No. It's interesting, we assign Frankenstein to kids, like to teenagers. It gets assigned in high schools a lot, because there's assumption that like people were more primitive in the 19th century. I guess they're the equivalent of teenagers today. If you've never read Frankenstein, and most of you haven't, how many of you have seen a Frankenstein movie? Okay. So, we're gonna start with a clip from a Frankenstein movie, just to set the table. Film was my field. Let's see if we can get the technology right. This is from 1931, a studio called Universal. The director was a man named James Whale. This is the iconic Frankenstein. And when people picture Frankenstein, both the monster and his creator, most often you're either picturing this movie or one of the hundreds of TV shows and movies that have sort of mimicked it. So let's watch the making of a monster. This is the moment of Frankenstein's genesis. Great scene. Colin Clive, the guy who plays Frankenstein, was a big star. Universal thought he was the star of the movie. This appears nowhere in the book. There's nothing like this in the book. In fact, Mary Shelley never tells us how the monster is brought to life. There's almost no mention of electricity. There's no mention specifically that corpses are used, right? The novel says that Frankenstein does research with the dead, which was controversial and very common in the late 1700s, early 1800s, doing experiments on cadavers. There's like an audience gathered there to watch this moment, right? His girlfriend is there, and his best friend is there, and his old college professor is there, and his hunchback assistant, who's named Fritz, not Igor, who's also not in the book. What happens in the book is Frankenstein self-isolates. Dr. Frankenstein goes away to college, gets a lot of dangerous ideas in college. I certainly hope so. That's what we did. That's what we're there for. Discovers that his research can go only so far, and then he voluntarily leaves the university and he goes off on his own. And he hides himself from his fiancée, he hides himself from his family, he gets this abandoned building, and he starts conducting these experiments alone. So really there's two kinds of isolation. There is self-isolation. There's a person who withdraws from his community. Why does he do that? Okay, part of it is ego. I am so much smarter than you guys. I'm thinking thoughts you guys can't even imagine. Driverless cars and an app that does everything and nuclear power. I'm so much smarter, so you guys can't understand me. So part of what I gain when I isolate, it's an active ego. It's also an admission of guilt. I hide what I do not want you to see. He knows what he's doing is crossing a line. And he withdraws from the world to create space for himself to do this. And it's really interesting because Frankenstein has had a great life. He's got loving parents, and he's got this beautiful cousin that he's going to marry because it's like the 1800s and that happens. And, you know, he's like not poor, and he gets this great education, and everybody tells him how smart he is. He does not have any problems. But he still pulls himself, he uproots himself, he hides himself away, and he becomes obsessed with cracking this greatest of all natural mystery. Science did not exist in 1816. When people used the word science in 1816, it just meant a skill. So a boxer can have science, a violinist can have science, a poet can have science, because it just means a skill. He was what at the time would be called a natural philosopher. And because natural philosophy encompassed both like scientific experimentation, but also philosophy, right? So he's like this professional thinking guy. And he pulls himself away to engage in this experiment. We get almost no physical description of the monster in Mary Shelley's book, just fragments. We know just a couple things. We know he's big because the human body is really complex and you wouldn't want to do all those fiddly little bits by candlelight. So he makes a big monster. We know the monster is hideous because it's described as hideous, but we don't know what he looks like. We don't know what what his sort of physiology is from the book. But what we know is Frankenstein makes the monster all alone, and the moment he sees the monster move, right, in the film, he's thrilled. He's super excited. It's alive, it's alive. In the book, the moment his creature moves, he is filled with revulsion and disgust. The moment it moves, he abandons it. I don't want to spoil the book for anybody, but it is the most anticlimactic scene in literary history. You have this climactic moment. Brilliant scientist cracks the secret of life, successfully animates an unliving body, and he leaves the house. He goes, and he doesn't see the monster again for 2 years. That act, the act of abandonment, that's the turning point in the book. That moment of turning away from a being for whom you are responsible. And the question of what do we owe our fellow creatures? The question of what obligations do we have with the living beings around us? That's a really big question in the early 1800s when Mary Shelley, who's 19 when she starts writing this book, she's a kid. Now, granted, 19 was a little bit different in 1816. You know, in 1816, you're going to send your kid out to be an apprentice at 7. You can join the Navy at 12 and the Army at 15. And most women would be married and starting to have kids by the time they're 16 and 17, but she's still quite young. She is living at a moment when important questions are being asked for the very first time. Mary Shelley's mother, Mary Wollstonecraft, was one of the first feminist thinkers. Mary Wollstonecraft wrote a book called The Vindication of the Rights of Women in 1792, where she made the radical proposition that women weren't actually inferior to men, they just had fewer opportunities. And that educating women and giving them a chance to, I don't know, do stuff would be all you needed to transform women into productive members of society. She died 11 days after Mary was born, and Mary grows up feeling terribly alone. She's feeling terribly alone because her mom is dead. She's feeling terribly alone because she is a woman who's being educated by her father and taught to want to be a writer at a time when women even having a profession was radical and weird. She's living at a time right? We're right after the French Revolution. We're right after the American Revolution. It's the beginning of the abolition movement in Britain. Chattel slavery is practiced universally across Europe. And people are starting to ask questions. Is it okay to keep other human beings in bondage? Is it okay for half of the human race, women, to be deprived even of the right of holding property? These questions are swirling around, and they form the crucial background to the book Frankenstein. With isolation, what I would propose as sort of the other side of the isolation equation is accountability. What do we owe the world? What does Frankenstein owe his creature? And that is the question that actually drives most of the novel. And in most of the novel, Victor Frankenstein is trying to avoid accountability. Whatever the monster does that is evil or bad or wrong, that's on the monster, not on him. Now, why the book was so popular and why the films based on the book are so different is kind of an interesting question. So, novel comes out. By the way, we owe Frankenstein to a volcano. In 1816, there was this big volcanic eruption in Indonesia. Mount Tambora blew up, and it threw up a bunch of dust into the atmosphere, and it lowered global temperatures. They called it the year without a summer. And there were famines and all kinds of awfulness. But Mary Shelley and her young husband and their buddies were vacationing that summer. But the weather was crappy because of the volcano. No one knew it was because of the volcano. So they had to stay inside. And because they had to stay inside, they had to come up with something to do. So they told each other scary stories. And that's the genesis of Frankenstein. It's bad weather. But the book comes out. Some people read it. She publishes it anonymously because women don't write. They certainly don't write books about insane natural philosophers messing around with cadavers. And it doesn't really kind of blow up until 1823 when a producer, a stage producer, puts on a stage play. And when he puts on a stage play of Frankenstein, it suddenly catches the national imagination. The book comes out. She attaches her name to it. There's a new edition. She starts to get a little bit famous. And, you know, one of the things it's interesting to me as a historian is even though Frankenstein never goes away as a story, at different periods of time, the story becomes more popular. We're getting a lot of Frankenstein properties being made right now. And that's because right now, questions of responsible science and questions of consciousness and all that is kind of at the forefront of our imaginations because of artificial intelligence. So in the 1820s, when it becomes popular, part of what's driving that popularity is the beginnings of a labor movement, the beginnings of an abolition movement, the beginnings of a variety of political movements that are suggesting that maybe all of these people that have been excluded should be included, the passage in Britain of a reformed poor law. Used to be able to allow people to, the good old days, used to be allow people to just starve in the street. The idea that the state should have an obligation to the least fortunate. And so this idea comes into vogue. Now, when this film comes out, it's 1931. What's happening in the early 1930s? The Great Depression. And all of a sudden, a whole bunch of people are homeless and wretched and poor and scared. And monster movies become all the rage in Hollywood. Now, the biggest change between the iconic movie monster, who we're going to meet in just a minute, and the monster in the book, it's such a great book. The monster in the movie does not speak. This is a scene in the film, a few minutes after the scene we just saw, in which Dr. Frankenstein wants to introduce his creation to light. And I think it's a really amazing moment. That actor is Boris Karloff, who becomes famous for his portrayal of the creature. It's a marvelous performance. He doesn't get to say a word. He has to do it all with his body and his hands. This is one of the only moments in the 1931 film that gives sort of a spark of humanity to this creature. And that gesture, right, reaching up for the light is taken away and he is left bereft. It's a poetic and an important moment because it adds some nuance and some complexity to a character that otherwise is a bit of a grotesque. But what I wanted to sort of point out here is before the time that Mary Shelley is writing this book, the world was simple. The king was the king because God said he was the king, and because he was the king, he was the law in the state. He could do what he wanted. Women were subordinated because they were inferior. That was easy. Black people were enslaved because God had created a scale of races. And conveniently, white Europeans were at the top and black Africans were at the bottom, and easy peasy. No questions. Things were the way they were because that's the way they were supposed to be. As we get into the 19th century, all of that is starting to be questioned, and all of that is starting to change in ways that make people uncomfortable. Because if the person that I'm looking at who is poor, if that poor person is poor either because they're a bad person or because they're supposed to be poor, then I don't owe them anything. Victor Frankenstein makes a creature who is hideous. And in the movie, they do this thing with the wrong brain. It's very funny. It becomes part of the joke, right? They want to put a brain in the creature. You send your hunchback assistant to get a brain. He drops the normal brain on the floor, butterfingers, and there's another jar, and it's conveniently labeled abnormal brain. And they put the abnormal brain in the creature. And then when the creature starts killing people, easy explanation: bad brain. We'll always find an easy explanation for why things are the way they are. But the question of, would the monster ever have been a monster had he had a different experience, that almost never comes up in the movies and in the TV shows and in the imaginary Frankenstein that plays in our head. This is a quote from Shelley's book, and much of Shelley's book is going to be a running dialogue between the creature and his creator. And that was in itself a very radical idea, the idea that you could talk to your creator and have a direct discussion and be like, dude, what was the thinking? One of their conversations, the creature says, I am an unfortunate and deserted creature. I look around and I have no relation or friend upon earth. These amiable people to whom I go have never seen me and know little of me. I am full of fear. For if I fail there, I am an outcast in the world forever. This is not an inarticulate, grunting hulk, all bolts and stitches. This is a creature who is self-aware. He says, I am malicious because I am miserable. Am I not shunned and hated by all mankind? He is aware of the fact that he is singular. singular and hideous. Any being whose consciousness is full of that sense of being abject and awful and uniquely bad, of having no friends, no prospects. You saw him. It's not like he could go to Denny's and get a job waiting tables. He's different, and that difference dooms him. I wanted to share one other quote that I think is powerful. Of my creation and my creator, I was completely ignorant, but I knew that I possessed no money, no friends, no kind of property. I was, besides, endued with a figure hideously deformed and loathsome. I was not even of the same nature as man. And skipping ahead a little bit, was I then a monster, a blot upon the earth from which all men fled and whom all men disowned? That monster, that being that can articulate its sense of loneliness, we don't see that monster in movies or TV shows or popular culture really until the 1990s. Because for a long time, it's going to be much easier to think of Victor Frankenstein as an anti-hero, a really bright guy who, yeah, he's made some mistakes, transgressed the laws of God and man, omelets, eggs, and his creature as an inevitable abomination. That's a much easier way of thinking about the story than to see what Mary Shelley's doing. And it's so interesting to me that like this book's never been out of print since 1823. It's one of the most popular and widely read novels still in the world. And yet, there is a part of this story we don't tell. And it's the part of the story that deals with isolation and how isolation leads specifically to violence, to crime, and to the destruction of the individual. What winds up destroying the lives of Victor Frankenstein is the fact that he made his creature to be alone. I want to show you guys, I prepared more clips than I could show. That's what I usually do. Let's see here. This is from a 1994 film that tries to restore the casting of Robert De Niro. I'm iffy on that, but this is Robert De Niro as Frankenstein's monster. That scene gets to me, and it gets to me because of the scene in the book, and that realization that this creature hates what he is, that his ugliness, the ugliness that people see him in. And this scene is in Mary Shelley's book, and the blind man, the encounter with the blind man who can see him more clearly because he is blind, because he can't really see the scars and the hideousness. And this changes the monster completely. Becomes impossible to see the story the way it played out in 1931 and the way it played out in lots of iterations of this story, because the moment that we see the monster not as monster, but as creature, a created thing, no more responsible for its existence than one of us is responsible for our own existence. We didn't call ourselves into being, right? And the refusal of his creator to make him less lonely. So what he wants in the novel, what he wants Frankenstein to do for him is make him a mate. His argument is simple. God made Adam a mate. so that man wouldn't be alone. He just wants a companion. And because Victor Frankenstein has a bad case of late onset conscience, Victor Frankenstein won't make another being to keep his other being company. I have a sense that I'm running low on time.
No, you're fine. I just came in because I'm
Okay.
this time. We have about 5 minutes until some people who have young children may need.
Well, then I'm just gonna show you one last clip, and then maybe that'll leave us a minute for some questions or comments. This is a final moment with the monster. This is from 2019, and now we are starting to see that maybe there's more to the creature than his monstrosity. This is from a television show called Penny Dreadful, and Victor Frankenstein has tracked down his creature, and his creature is a murderer. His creature is a monster now, because he has been driven mad by loneliness. And now he's going to confront his creature, but let the creature have the last word. That's a chaser. We need a chaser. Horror and monster stories. It's a good season for it, coming out of Halloween. They have a place in our lives and in our culture. It's a kind of recreational terror that lets us enjoy at a safe remove some of the things that legitimately frighten us. We are legitimately frightened about the potential of science run amok. We are legitimately frightened by the potential of technologies that can bring life and maybe even consciousness into being, something that in the past has been outside the scope of human activity. We're frightened of mass shooters. We're frightened of lonely and deranged persons. We're frightened of being left alone ourselves. Isolation is a primal terror. And that was as much a primal terror for Mary Shelley, who in the 2 years between when she began this book and when the book was published would lose 2 of her 3 children. She would lose her husband 2 years after that. Only 1 of her children would survive, and she would live as a unique creature, a female novelist, a strange specimen. Lots of people are lonely, lots of people are isolated. The act of turning away from the mess he made sets in motion all of the things that turned a victim of Victor Frankenstein into a monster made by him. And when we see in the 1990s film and the 2019 show, when we can see the victim under the atrocious monster, it changes our frame of reference. And it reminds us of the role we might play into making things more monstrous as we move through the world. And I will end there. I would be happy to entertain any questions or comments or...
First of all, we want to say thank you.
My pleasure.
What I understand was back from my next door neighbor here in seating arrangements has said it's been just a fabulous presentation.
Well, thank you.
I cannot wait to go home and watch it.
I gave her $5 to say that, so thank you.
Thank you so much, and I know a number of us have to leave, but I suspect, Eddie, would you be willing if people...
Yeah, no, I would love that. I can hang out. Yes?
If only, I applaud you, sir. If only you could end with that we'd be reminded of the redemption we could bestow on others if we saw new, if we saw what was possible in turning that around each tormented soul.
Well, and not look at surfaces, right? Not look at the scarred surface, so what he calls his shattered visage, right? It's like Those exteriors don't tell us who lies beneath. It's a story with a powerful it's got many powerful messages, but that's certainly one of them. And the moment with the blind man, right, this encounter, if two human beings just encounter each other as human beings without that kind of reactionary frame of reference, a totally different relationship becomes possible. It's a beautiful thing.
It's like adults were afraid of the monster. Children were not.
No, children understand the monster. And that's because, you know, children, the world's a very frightening place for a kid. You're surrounded by processes and people that have power over you and all of this stuff. And of course, the director Guillermo del Toro has described this as Frankenstein is the ultimate teen angst novel, right? Because every teenager at some point feels like they're this uniquely ugly, horrible, lonely thing, right? But it is interesting that you know, within, and even in the 1930s, kids understood the monster. He's a very popular walk around at the Universal theme park. People like to get their picture taken with Frankenstein. Any questions about the book or anything? Okay. Well, thank you all so much. Enjoy your Sunday.